Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm journey into the hidden world of Stalin's Soviet Union during the Second World War. This is not about battles at the front, but about the lives of ordinary people caught between hunger, fear, and relentless demands of the state. We will walk quietly through their reality, where survival itself became an everyday struggle. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. Imagine streets filled with silence, homes without warmth, and a constant shadow of watchful eyes. This is the world we're stepping into. When the war began in 1941, life in the Soviet Union was already harsh. Stalin's rule had reshaped society with strict control, forced labour, and little room for personal freedom. The invasion by Nazi Germany turned this difficult existence into something far more severe. Families across the vast land suddenly faced shortages of food, clothing, and fuel. Entire cities were redirected toward the war effort, and what little resources remained for civilians had to be shared among millions. Bread became the symbol of life itself. In some regions, a day's ration was a small piece of dark bread, often stretched with sawdust or other fillers to make it last. People lined up for hours in freezing cold, holding ration cards that determined whether they would eat that day. Mothers gave their portions to children, and neighbours quietly shared scraps with each other, even though sharing meant risking hunger themselves. Hunger was not the only shadow. Fear of the state never left. Even during the war, political suspicion remained strong. A careless word about Stalin or the government could lead to punishment, imprisonment, or worse. People learned to whisper inside their homes, knowing that walls could carry voices and that trust could not always be given freely, even to those closest to them. Despite this, life had to continue. Children still attended school, though classrooms were often cold and bare, with teachers repeating messages about loyalty and sacrifice. Many young boys and girls were sent to work in factories or fields, far too early, their hands becoming rough with labour while their minds carried dreams they could not share. Cities changed rapidly. Moscow, Leningrad, and countless smaller towns were fortified, with trenches dug and buildings camouflaged against bombings. Air raid sirens became part of the rhythm of life, sending people running to shelters, clutching whatever they could carry. Nights were long and restless, lit only by candles or dim lamps when electricity was cut to save power for the military. Yet in these difficult conditions, people also found ways to hold on to hope. Families sang old songs together to keep spirits alive. Handwritten letters from the front were read and reread until the paper wore thin. In kitchens, women learned to cook meals out of almost nothing, turning potato peels into soups and finding wild herbs in the countryside to bring flavour back to the table. Religion, though discouraged by the state, quietly endured. Old icons were hidden behind curtains, prayers whispered at night, and church bells, when allowed, reminded people that faith could not be fully silenced. For many, belief was as essential as bread. This first glimpse into Soviet life during the war shows how survival was not only about enduring bombings or battles, but about living each day in an atmosphere of hunger, caution, and resilience. The story we're beginning is not one of quick victories or heroic marches, but of quiet endurance, carried by millions of ordinary people whose names are rarely remembered. When the German invasion deepened into Soviet lands, evacuation became a word many families would never forget. Entire trains filled with civilians, women, children, the elderly, moved eastward toward the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and Central Asia. These journeys were long, cold, and uncertain. People carried only what they could hold in their hands or fit into a single suitcase. Sometimes it was a blanket, sometimes a pot, often a family photograph tucked carefully into clothing. The trains were overcrowded, wooden benches packed with strangers, windows sealed against the winter wind. Food was scarce along the way, and people survived on thin soup handed out at railway stops or crusts of bread shared between families. Many children grew sick during the trip, weakened by cold and hunger, and mothers did their best to comfort them with soft words, even when they had none of their own strength left. life in the new places was not easier. Those evacuated to small villages often found themselves unwelcome, as locals already struggled to feed themselves. Houses had to be shared by several families, with strangers sleeping side by side on floors, separated only by sheets or coats hung for a little privacy. Factories dismantled in western cities were rebuilt in the east, and civilians, including children as young as 12, were sent straight to the production lines. Day after day they worked in freezing halls, making weapons, uniforms and machinery. There was little heat, little light, and the sound of machines never stopped. The war had turned every hand into a soldier's hand, even if it held no rifle. Those who remained in cities closer to the front faced different hardships. Bombing shook the ground, forcing people to spend nights in cellars or underground stations. In Moscow, families huddled on station platforms, listening to the dull roar of planes above and waiting for the all-clear signal. The smell of damp walls, kerosene lamps, and fear became familiar companions. Children played with scraps of wood or drew pictures in the dust, trying to create some sense of normality beneath the earth. Rationing grew stricter as the months passed. Meat disappeared from most diets, sugar became a dream, and even flour was often mixed with substitutes. Some learned to cook soups from nettles, pine needles, or dried leaves. Black markets quietly flourished. But prices were so high that only the desperate or fortunate could trade. A pair of boots might cost more than a month's wages, and sometimes the currency was not rubles at all, but bread or tobacco. Despite these conditions, Soviet propaganda painted bright pictures. Posters showed smiling workers, brave soldiers, and mothers holding healthy children, promising that victory was near and sacrifice was noble. Radio broadcasts filled the silence with stirring speeches, but people listening in cold rooms often wondered how long their strength could last. Still, endurance became the greatest weapon of all. Families learned to adapt, to live with less, and to survive each day as it came, in the small details, the sharing of a potato, the kindness of a stranger on a crowded train, the sound of a lullaby sung softly in the dark. Life continued, quietly and stubbornly, against all odds. In the countryside, the war reshaped life in ways just as harsh as in the cities. Villages lost many of their men to the front, leaving women, children, and the elderly to carry the weight of farming and survival. Collective farms, already under strict control before the war, now became centres of desperate labour. Fields that once held wheat or rye were often bare, as machinery had been sent to military factories and horses taken by the army. Women ploughed with their own hands, pulling simple wooden tools through the soil where no animals remained. The harvest was meagre, yet quotas were still demanded. The state required grain deliveries to feed soldiers first, leaving almost nothing for those who had grown it. Families learned to live on whatever they could find in forests and fields. Wild berries, mushrooms, and even tree bark became part of the diet. Children carried baskets into the woods, not for play, but for survival. In harsh winters, boiled potato peels and watery porridge were considered feasts. Hunger wore away at everyone, but villagers carried on, bound by duty and by the quiet knowledge that survival itself was resistance. Clothing was another daily battle. With factories focused on uniforms, ordinary people had to mend and reuse what little they had. A single coat was shared among siblings. Boots were passed from child to child, and cloth scraps were patched until the fabric could no longer hold. Old blankets became jackets, and straw was sometimes stuffed into shoes for warmth. The cold of the Russian winter spared no one, and fires were often weak, as wood too was scarce. Schools in the countryside continued, but lessons were often brief and interrupted by farm work. Teachers, underfed and exhausted, tried to maintain discipline while students arrived barefoot or in torn clothes. Instead of books, children sometimes wrote lessons on scraps of newspaper. History classes emphasized loyalty to the state, and maps of the Soviet Union decorated the walls, reminding even the youngest that their future belonged to the collective struggle. Communication with soldiers at the front came through letters. These were treasured items passed from hand to hand, read aloud in kitchens lit by candles. Soldiers wrote of bravery and duty, though the truth was often far darker. Still, those words gave families strength, even when no more letters arrived. Silence became a language of its own, heavy and unspoken. Religious traditions, though discouraged, quietly survived in villages. Women lit candles before hidden icons, whispering prayers for sons and husbands. Easter bread was baked in secret, often from coarse flour and water, but still blessed with hope. Faith became a private rebellion, a reminder that not all power rested in the hands of the state. Even in these struggles there was resilience. Villagers learned to share, to gather together during long nights, telling stories to children and singing old songs. These moments, fragile but real, kept the human spirit alive in a time when every day was measured not in dreams but in endurance. In the besieged city of Leningrad, life reached a level of hardship that remains one of the darkest chapters of the war. When the German army surrounded the city in September 1941, nearly 3 million civilians were trapped inside. Supplies were cut off, and what followed was a siege that lasted almost 900 days. Ration cards became the only hope of survival, yet the daily portions grew smaller with each passing month. By the winter of 1941-1942, adults received only a few ounces of bread per day, often mixed with sawdust or ground husks to make it stretch further. Children were given even less. Hunger shaped every thought and action. People boiled wallpaper paste for its starch, cooked leather belts until they softened enough to chew, and searched for anything that might quiet the pain of an empty stomach. The streets were filled with silence, broken only by the crunch of snow under weak footsteps. Those who collapsed from hunger were often left lying where they fell, as neighbours no longer had the strength to carry them. Despite the suffering, the city did not give up. Workers continued to build weapons in frozen factories, their breath visible in the cold air as they assembled shells and rifles with trembling hands. Musicians played concerts to remind people that culture had not died. In December 1942, the famous Leningrad Symphony by Shostakovich was performed in the starving city, with musicians so weak that some had to be carried onto the stage. The music became a symbol of endurance, a declaration that spirit could outlast hunger. The winter cold was another enemy. With little fuel, apartments froze. Families huddled together under blankets, burning furniture, books, and anything that could produce a spark. Windows were sealed with ice, and frost spread across walls like white flowers. Water was collected from holes cut into the frozen Neva River, carried home in buckets by people whose strength was nearly gone. Yet even in these conditions, daily life persisted in fragments. Children continued to learn, often in unheated classrooms, writing lessons with frozen fingers. Mothers whispered stories at night, trying to distract their little ones from the sound of their stomachs. Small gardens were planted in spring, and every leaf, every root was eaten with gratitude. Religion returned quietly, as many sought hope where food and warmth could not be found. Icons reappeared, hidden crosses were worn openly again, and prayers rose in the darkness, carried by those who believed survival itself was a form of faith. The siege finally broke in 1944, but by then, hundreds of thousands had died from hunger, cold, and bombardment. The survivors carried memories that would never leave them. The taste of bark and paste, the silence of empty streets, and the unbroken spirit of a city that refused to surrender. The story of Leningrad was not just about endurance. It was about humanity clinging to life when everything seemed lost. Factories across the Soviet Union became battlefields of a different kind. As the front consumed millions of soldiers, the rear was ordered to supply endless streams of weapons, ammunition, and uniforms. Entire industries were uprooted from western regions and transported thousands of miles eastward, often in the middle of winter. Machines were loaded onto trains, carried over frozen rivers, and rebuilt in empty fields or barns. Workers arrived with little more than their hands and determination, setting up production lines under open skies until roofs could be constructed. Many of these workers were women, teenagers, and even children who had never before stepped into a factory. With so many men at the front, women took over welding, forging and assembling heavy machinery. Young girls learned to rivet aircraft wings. Boys not yet 16 ran lathes and presses. Their days stretched into nights, with shifts lasting 12, sometimes 16 hours. The sound of hammers, engines and grinding metal filled the air, drowning out fatigue but never hunger. Conditions were brutal. Factories were cold, lit by dim lamps and poorly ventilated. Workers stood for hours in worn-out shoes, often with no gloves to protect their hands. Meals were small, sometimes just thin cabbage soup or a slice of bread, and sleep was short. Yet output had to grow constantly. Posters on the walls declared that every bullet saved a soldier, every tank was a victory. The sense of duty became stronger than exhaustion. Pride in contribution kept people moving, even when bodies ached and eyes blurred from lack of rest. Children, too, carried heavy burdens. After school, they gathered scrap metal, collected herbs for medicine, or sewed bags for supplies. Some were sent directly into production, their small hands able to reach places adults could not. Though childhood was swallowed by war, many accepted it quietly, knowing their labour might mean survival for a father or brother far away. Despite these sacrifices, accidents were frequent. Machines broke down, injuries occurred, and sometimes entire workshops froze in the dead of winter. But workers adapted, finding ways to improvise repairs and push forward. Inventiveness became a weapon in itself, with mechanics and engineers designing new tools from scraps and solving problems with little more than determination. Letters from the front reminded workers why they endured. Soldiers often thanked the invisible army in the rear, describing how a sturdy rifle or warm boots had saved lives. These words, carried on fragile paper, were read aloud in dormitories and factory halls, giving strength to hands that could barely hold tools. At the end of each shift, exhausted workers walked home through dark streets, guided by the dim glow of lanterns. They carried not victory but survival, and the knowledge that without their endless labour, the war could not be fought. Factories had become fortresses, and those inside were warriors in their own quiet, uncelebrated way. The role of propaganda in Stalin's Soviet Union during the war was impossible to escape. Posters covered city walls, urging citizens to give their last strength for victory. They showed smiling workers handing rifles to soldiers, mothers waving proudly as sons marched to the front, and farmers delivering golden harvests, even though in reality most people faced hunger and exhaustion. Newspapers repeated the same message: loyalty, sacrifice, and unity under Stalin's leadership. Every story praised the heroism of the people and the wisdom of the state, leaving little space for truth. Radio broadcasts filled homes and factories with speeches that carried both encouragement and warning. A voice might speak of courage and endurance, but behind it was always the reminder that failure or doubt could not be tolerated. Listening became part of daily routine, whether one believed the words or not. In schools, children learned slogans alongside their lessons. They memorized poems praising the Red Army, drew pictures of tanks rolling across fields, and listened as teachers told stories of heroes who gave their lives without hesitation. Patriotism was not just encouraged, it was demanded. Even young pioneers, the Soviet Youth Organization, wore red scarves proudly, understanding that loyalty to the state was expected before loyalty to anything else. At the same time, propaganda worked hand in hand with fear. Citizens knew that questioning official messages could be dangerous. A careless remark overheard by a neighbour might lead to interrogation. Trust was fragile, and many learned to repeat slogans outwardly, while keeping private thoughts hidden deep inside. Yet propaganda also gave people strength in its own way. Posters and films created symbols of resilience: soldiers standing tall, mothers enduring hardship, workers forging weapons despite hunger. These images, though far from reality, reminded people that they were part of something larger than themselves. The idea that every sacrifice contributed to victory gave meaning to suffering. Cultural life was also guided by this system. Writers and artists were expected to produce works that inspired, not questioned. Songs celebrated the homeland, plays honoured soldiers, and films painted Stalin as a father figure guiding the nation. Even in the bleakest conditions, theatres sometimes opened, offering audiences a glimpse of hope through carefully approved stories. For many, attending these performances was both a distraction and a reminder of the official line. Yet despite control, small sparks of personal creativity survived. Families shared old songs in their kitchens, stories passed down from grandparents, or jokes whispered in safe company. These moments were fragile, hidden from the public eye, but they preserved a sense of individuality in a world where every message was supposed to come from above. Propaganda shaped daily life like the air people breathed, inescapable, heavy, and sometimes sustaining, sometimes suffocating. It was both a shield and a chain, guiding thought and action, and it left its mark on every corner of the Soviet Union during those long years of war. Daily life in Soviet cities during the war was marked by endless shortages. Ration cards dictated survival, and without them, people had little chance of finding food. Long lines formed before dawn, stretching across streets, with families waiting for hours in the cold for a loaf of bread or a handful of potatoes. Shops were almost bare, shelves holding only a few tins or sacks that disappeared quickly. For many, the ration was so small that it could not sustain life, forcing people to invent meals from scraps. Housewives boiled weeds into soup, baked pancakes from ground acorns, or stretched a few spoonfuls of flour into thin porridge. The black market became a secret lifeline. In back alleys and quiet corners, people traded whatever they had, clothing, jewellery, or family heirlooms, for food. A pair of boots could be exchanged for a sack of potatoes. A gold ring might buy a week's worth of bread. Yet even this market was dangerous, both because prices were unbearable and because discovery could bring punishment. Still, desperation drove people to take risks. Housing was equally difficult. Cities overflowed with evacuees and workers, so apartments were shared by several families at once. A single room might hold 10 or more people, with blankets hung to divide space. Privacy disappeared, and quarrels over space or noise were common, yet most endured silently, knowing everyone faced the same hardship. Heating was another struggle. Coal and wood were scarce, so people burned furniture, old shoes, or anything that would catch fire. Rooms often froze, frost creeping across walls and windows, while families huddled under layers of clothing at night. Despite exhaustion, city dwellers carried on with routines. Children went to school when possible, learning in cold classrooms with little paper or ink. Adults reported to factories, offices, or construction sites, often walking miles through snow because trams no longer ran. Illness spread quickly in such conditions. With hospitals overcrowded and medicine in short supply, many relied on home remedies, herbs, compresses, or sheer endurance. Doctors worked without rest, but supplies were so limited that even basic bandages were treasured. Families leaned on letters from the front to keep hope alive. A postcard, sometimes arriving weeks late, was enough to lift spirits for days. These fragile pieces of paper were read over and over, folded carefully, and tucked into pockets as reminders that loved ones still lived. Loss, however, was constant. Notices of death or disappearance came silently, often delivered on slips of paper. Neighbours mourned quietly, with no ceremonies, as grief had become too common to mark each loss fully. And yet, amid hunger, cold, and sorrow, people found ways to endure. Small gardens were planted in courtyards, songs were sung in kitchens, and stories were told by candlelight. These fragments of normal life carried families through days when survival seemed impossible, proving that even in the harshest times the human spirit could not be entirely broken. The Soviet countryside bore a burden no less heavy than the cities. Collective farms, already under state control before the war, were stripped of manpower when millions of men were sent to the front. What remained were women, children, and the elderly, tasked with keeping the nation fed. Quotas for grain, meat, and vegetables did not shrink despite the hardships. The state demanded shipments to support the Red Army, and local officials were under pressure to deliver them on time. This meant that even when harvests were poor, villages had to surrender much of their produce, leaving families with almost nothing. Women became the backbone of rural life. They rose before dawn, walked into the fields, and worked with the same intensity as men once did. Without animals to pull ploughs, most had been taken by the army. Women and children sometimes harnessed themselves to wooden tools, dragging them through stubborn soil. The work was back-breaking, but crops had to be planted, tended, and harvested, no matter how small the yield. Hunger followed everywhere. Families boiled weeds, made flour from acorns or ground up tree bark, and gathered mushrooms or berries whenever they could. Children carried baskets into the forest, their small feet worn bare, searching for anything edible. Kitchens smelled not of bread or meat, but of thin stews that offered warmth more than nourishment. Despite the endless labour, there was little recognition. Propaganda posters praised workers in the fields, but villagers knew that their sacrifices went largely unnoticed. Still, they continued, bound by duty and by the hope that their effort might save the lives of fathers, sons, and brothers at the front. Schooling in rural areas was often disrupted. Teachers were scarce, classrooms were unheated, and lessons competed with the demands of farm work. Children learned to read and write when possible, often on scraps of paper or the backs of old letters. Loyalty to the state was emphasized as much as arithmetic, with children reciting slogans about sacrifice and duty alongside their lessons. The seasons shaped everything. Winters were cruel, with snow covering villages in silence. Families burned whatever wood they could find, sometimes dismantling fences or sheds to keep fires alive. Summers demanded endless toil in the fields, with women bending under the sun for hours. Spring brought mud, making roads impassable, and autumn was filled with worry about whether the harvest would be enough to survive another year. Yet even in this bleak reality, communities tried to preserve fragments of tradition. Songs were sung after long days of work, and old folk stories were whispered to children at night. Religious practices, though discouraged, survived in secret. Easter bread was baked when possible, even if it was only flour and water, and icons hidden during the day were quietly revealed at night for prayer. Life in the countryside during the war was a story of unending labour, hunger, and resilience. The villagers, though invisible to history's grand stage, carried much of the weight of survival, their endurance written not in books but in the furrows of the land and the silence of their sacrifices. The role of children in Stalin's Soviet Union during the war was both heartbreaking and remarkable. Childhood, as most would imagine it, disappeared almost overnight. Schools remained open when possible, but many students were pulled out to join the workforce. Some stood beside their mothers in fields, dragging ploughs or gathering crops. Others entered factories, their small hands nimble enough to manage delicate parts of machinery. By the age of 12, many worked shifts as long as adults, returning home exhausted, yet expected to continue chores or study in freezing classrooms. Even in school, lessons were shaped by the war. Textbooks were scarce, so children wrote in old notebooks, erasing pages to reuse them. Teachers emphasized loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. Pupils memorized poems glorifying soldiers and painted pictures of tanks, planes, and heroic workers. Stories of selfless young pioneers who supposedly gave their lives for the state were repeated as examples to follow. This constant presence of propaganda shaped how children saw the world. Yet outside the classroom, their reality was harsher. Food rations for children were smaller than for adults, and hunger marked their days. Many grew thin and weak, their clothes hanging loose on bony frames. Shoes were rare. Some walked barefoot through snow, wrapping their feet in cloth or straw. Illness spread quickly, and without proper medicine, recovery often depended on endurance alone. Play was not entirely forgotten, but it looked different. Children carved toys from scraps of wood, made dolls from rags, or played war with sticks in empty lots. Their laughter, though brief, reminded families that even in the bleakest times, innocence could flicker like a small flame. Letters from fathers or brothers at the front were treasured. Children often read them aloud repeatedly, dreaming of the day their loved ones would return. Some wrote back, filling pages with simple drawings of houses, flowers, or smiling faces. These small tokens carried enormous weight, providing comfort to soldiers far away. Sadly, many children were not spared the war's direct violence. In occupied territories, they faced bombings, deportations, or even starvation under enemy control. Orphans became a common sight, wandering streets in search of food or shelter. State-run orphanages tried to take them in, but overcrowding and shortages meant many suffered even there. Despite all this, children displayed remarkable resilience. They learned to shoulder responsibilities far beyond their years, to survive on little, and to adapt quickly to changing realities. Their stories were rarely told in official accounts, overshadowed by battles and leaders. Yet they too were part of the war effort, not by choice but by necessity. In their endurance lay a quiet strength that carried families forward. Childhood in wartime Soviet Union was not measured in games or carefree days, but in survival, duty, and the fragile hope that life would one day return to something resembling normal. The Soviet healthcare system during the war was stretched to its breaking point. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers, leaving little space or resources for civilians. Medical staff worked endlessly, often with no proper equipment. Doctors reused bandages, sterilized needles over open flames, and improvised medicines from whatever herbs or chemicals they could find. Nurses, many of them very young, carried patients through hallways lit by dim lamps, their own bodies weakened by hunger and lack of sleep. In cities, epidemics spread quickly. Malnutrition lowered immunity, and diseases like typhus and dysentery took hold. Vaccines and antibiotics were scarce, so entire neighbourhoods sometimes suffered at once. Families turned to home remedies, boiling herbs for teas, using garlic and onions as natural disinfectants, or wrapping wounds in rags cleaned with boiling water. Mothers whispered prayers as they treated their children with whatever they had, hoping strength alone would carry them through. In rural areas, medical help was even more limited. A single doctor might serve dozens of villages, arriving by horse-drawn cart or on foot. Villagers often relied on local healers, who used folk knowledge to ease pain when modern supplies were unavailable. Despite its fragility, the system tried to maintain some form of care. Mobile medical units travelled with the Red Army, and special trains carried the wounded from the front to larger hospitals further inland. These trains were crowded, filled with moans of pain and the smell of blood mixed with smoke from coal stoves. For civilians, entering a hospital was both hope and fear. Beds were lined side by side, often without sheets, and the air was thick with illness. Patients shared food if they had any, and relatives brought supplies because hospitals could not provide enough. Yet even in these grim spaces, human kindness appeared. Doctors who had not slept for days still smiled at patients, and nurses sang softly to calm frightened children. Pharmacies were nearly empty, but people found ways to adapt. Old remedies, passed down through generations, became valuable again. Birch sap was used to strengthen the weak, honey for healing wounds, and herbal compresses for fevers. These simple methods could not replace real medicine, but they offered comfort when nothing else remained. Propaganda often painted an idealized picture of Soviet healthcare, with posters showing smiling nurses and strong patients. The reality was far harsher, but the dedication of medical workers gave some truth to the image. Their sacrifice kept countless people alive, even when tools and medicines were missing. The war turned every hospital into a battlefield of its own, one fought not with weapons but with endurance, improvisation, and compassion. The Soviet winter was more than a season, it was a second enemy. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, and for families already weakened by hunger, the cold could be deadly. Apartments in the cities had little or no heating. Coal and wood were directed toward factories or the military, leaving civilians to improvise. People burned old furniture, wooden floorboards, or even books to keep a fire alive for a few hours. Windows were sealed with rags or paper, but frost still crept across the glass in thick white layers. Indoors, families wore coats, scarves and boots, sleeping fully dressed under piles of blankets if they had them. In rural areas, winters were harsher still. Villagers gathered brushwood from forests, often hauling it miles through deep snow. With animals scarce, people themselves pulled sledges loaded with heavy logs. Even then, fires often burned low, and smoke filled small houses where chimneys cracked from overuse. Frostbite was common, leaving hands and feet permanently damaged. Children walked to school in bitter cold, sometimes fainting along the way, while teachers tried to teach in classrooms so frozen that ink turned solid inside inkwells. Food shortages made the cold harder to bear. Thin soup or dry bread offered little warmth. Families collected potato peels or boiled bones again and again to extract the last bit of nourishment. People learned to survive on tea made from pine needles, which at least gave strength and prevented sickness. Nights were the hardest. The silence of snow-covered streets was broken only by the sound of the wind against empty buildings. Families lay awake, huddled close, listening for air raid sirens or simply waiting for dawn. In besieged Leningrad, the cold and hunger combined into suffering beyond measure. Citizens cut holes in the frozen Neva River to collect water, dragging buckets through icy streets. Fires were so precious that people shared matches, lighting one carefully, protecting its small flame with their hands as if it were life itself. Yet even in the midst of this frozen world, resilience appeared. Neighbours shared what little warmth they had, inviting each other into small kitchens where a single stove might heat more than one family. Children invented games indoors, pretending frost flowers on windows were magical landscapes. Songs, stories, and whispered prayers created a fragile comfort against the endless night. The Soviet winter tested every part of human endurance. It demanded strength of body and willpower of spirit. For those who survived, it became a memory impossible to forget. The sting of icy wind, the crunch of frozen bread, and the feeling of life balanced on the edge of each breath in the bitter cold. Religion in Stalin's Soviet Union during the war lived in the shadows. Officially, the state had long declared faith unnecessary, even harmful, and many churches were closed or turned into warehouses, granaries, or meeting halls. Priests were arrested or silenced, and religious holidays were stripped of their public celebration. Yet when war broke out, faith returned quietly, woven into the daily survival of countless families. Mothers whispered prayers before their children left for school, crossing themselves quickly when no one could see. Icons, hidden for years behind curtains or inside cupboards, were carefully brought out again, kissed, and placed near candles that flickered in cold rooms. Even in the most dangerous times, people found strength in these small rituals. The siege of Leningrad revealed how powerful belief could be. In a city of hunger and silence, citizens lined up outside a cathedral once closed by the state. When its doors reopened, prayers rose alongside the sounds of artillery. Worshippers gathered, their voices trembling but firm, finding unity not in politics but in faith. The act itself was defiance, though no one called it so. In rural villages, religion had never truly disappeared. Old women carried traditions forward, baking simple bread for Easter, or painting eggs when flour and dye could be found. At night, families sang hymns softly, their voices blending with the howl of the wind. Weddings and funerals, though stripped of ceremony, still carried the weight of blessing. A whispered prayer at a graveside, a cross drawn in the air, these were acts of resilience. The state, noticing the persistence of faith, cautiously shifted its stance during the war. Hoping to inspire unity, authorities allowed some churches to reopen and priests to return to their duties. Religious radio broadcasts were permitted, carefully monitored but real. Stalin himself, once the destroyer of churches, now recognized their value for morale. For believers, it was not a return to freedom, but it was enough to offer comfort in desperate times. Religion also took on personal forms. Soldiers at the front carried small crosses or folded pieces of scripture in their pockets, talismans against death. Mothers prayed over letters before sending them to sons, believing their words might carry divine protection. Even those who had abandoned belief sometimes returned to it, seeking meaning in the chaos. Yet fear remained. Expressing faith too openly could still bring suspicion, and many balanced devotion with caution. Icons were wrapped in cloth, candles hidden until nightfall, prayers whispered rather than sung aloud. It was a life lived between silence and belief. In the end, religion during the war became less about doctrine and more about survival. It was hope, comfort, and quiet strength when little else remained. The flicker of a candle before an icon, the murmur of a prayer in the dark. These small acts carried people through, reminding them that even in the harshest times, the human spirit reached upward, searching for light. The experience of women in Stalin's Soviet Union during the war was one of the most demanding and overlooked struggles. With so many men gone to the front, women became the backbone of daily life. They filled factories, fields, offices, and hospitals, taking on roles once reserved for men while still carrying the weight of family responsibilities. In cities, women worked in munitions plants, welding metal, assembling rifles, or sewing uniforms. Their shifts often lasted 12 hours or more, and when they finished, they returned to crowded apartments to care for children and elderly relatives. Exhaustion was constant, but there was no choice. Without their labour, soldiers would have lacked weapons and families would have starved. In rural villages, women's lives were even harder. They woke before dawn to work the fields, pulling ploughs themselves when no animals were left, and harvesting grain that was often taken away by the state. Afterward they returned home to cook meagre meals, mend clothes, and keep children warm in bitter winters. Every season demanded strength, and women carried burdens that seemed endless. Many also joined the Red Army itself. Female snipers, medics, and pilots became symbols of courage, though their service was rarely recognized equally with men's. Young women flew night missions in outdated planes, guiding them through darkness with little more than instinct and courage. Others crawled across battlefields to rescue the wounded, dragging men twice their size to safety. Countless more worked as nurses in frontline hospitals, facing blood, chaos, and exhaustion every day. The emotional toll was equally heavy. Women were often the keepers of hope, writing letters to soldiers, waiting for replies, and comforting children when news of death or disappearance arrived. They carried grief silently, with no time to pause or mourn. Funerals were rare luxuries. Most losses were marked with tears shed in kitchens or whispered prayers at night. Despite these hardships, women showed resilience that kept entire communities alive. They learned to improvise, turning scraps of cloth into clothing, stretching food into soups, and fixing tools with whatever was at hand. They supported each other, sharing bread, childcare, or even a few hours of rest. Their networks of quiet cooperation became invisible threads holding families together. Propaganda praised women as heroines, depicting them smiling at machines or waving to soldiers. The reality was far less glamorous, but the recognition, however shallow, reflected a truth. Without women, the Soviet Union could not have endured the war. Their labour, courage, and endurance were as vital as the battles fought on the front lines. Yet when the war ended, many returned to lives of silence, their sacrifices rarely acknowledged. They became the unsung pillars of survival, remembered in private stories but often absent from history books. Their strength, though hidden, remains one of the most remarkable legacies of that time. The world of Soviet soldiers' families during the war was filled with uncertainty, silence, and waiting. Every household had someone at the front: fathers, brothers, sons, husbands, and life at home revolved around the hope of their return. Letters became the fragile lifeline connecting battlefields to kitchens and courtyards. A single postcard scribbled in pencil could bring joy greater than food itself. Families read these words again and again, sometimes until the paper wore thin. Soldiers often wrote about courage, comradeship, and love, but rarely about the horrors they faced, sparing their relatives from worry. Still, the absence of letters spoke louder than words. Weeks of silence turned into months, and many families lived in dread of the dreaded knock on the door. When official notices arrived, brief slips of paper declaring missing in action or killed in battle, grief was often swallowed in quiet tears. There was no time or space for mourning when survival demanded constant effort. Widows carried on alone, raising children while working long shifts in factories or fields. Young boys tried to take on responsibilities beyond their years, chopping wood, queuing for rations, or watching over younger siblings. Girls helped with sewing, cooking, and endless chores, growing up quickly in the shadow of loss. Grandparents became anchors in many households, passing down stories to distract children from hunger and fear, offering wisdom when little else remained. Despite sorrow, communities leaned on one another. Neighbours shared news, helped with childcare, or offered a slice of bread to a family struck by tragedy. Shared hardship created quiet bonds of solidarity. Funerals were rare, as bodies were seldom returned from the front, but families held private rituals, lighting candles before hidden icons, whispering names of the dead, or keeping a soldier's belongings as sacred relics. The emotional burden was heavy. Mothers carried both pride and fear, proud of sons who defended the motherland, but fearful they would never return. Wives lived between hope and despair, clutching at every rumour of victory while dreading every silence. Children sometimes grew resentful of fathers they barely remembered, but more often they clung to idealised images of them as heroes. Propaganda reinforced this, filling schools and posters with stories of brave soldiers. The state encouraged families to be proud, to see sacrifice as noble, but behind closed doors grief remained raw and unspoken. Even so, many families found ways to endure. They celebrated birthdays with small gatherings, baking cakes from scraps of flour, singing songs to remember better times. They marked holidays with makeshift traditions, creating a sense of normality for children who had known only war. These small acts of life carried them forward, step by step, as they waited for doors to open and loved ones to return. For many, that day never came, but the strength of families, quiet, unrecorded, and often invisible, was as vital to survival as any victory on the battlefield. Education during the war years became a strange mixture of duty, hardship, and survival. Schools across the Soviet Union tried to keep functioning, even when classrooms were bombed, unheated, or overcrowded with children of evacuees. Teachers carried on with almost no supplies. Chalk was scarce, so lessons were sometimes scratched onto boards with bits of stone. Paper was reused, pages filled, erased, and filled again. Children often sat in heavy coats and mittens, their breath visible in the icy air while teachers lectured with frozen fingers. Hunger shaped the school day as much as lessons did. Many pupils fainted during classes, unable to concentrate on arithmetic or grammar with empty stomachs. Rations for children were minimal, so schools tried to organise communal kitchens, serving thin soups or porridge. These meals were small, but they often meant the difference between staying in class and collapsing on the way home. Discipline was strict, yet teachers also showed compassion, knowing what their students endured. Beyond reading and writing, schools were tools of propaganda. History lessons glorified past heroes, geography emphasised the vastness of the Soviet land, and literature often included poems praising the Red Army. Children were taught loyalty before independence of thought. They recited slogans, sang patriotic songs, and practiced drills in case of air raids. Even physical education was framed as preparation for service, with boys taught to march and girls encouraged to show endurance. Despite the official tone, education sometimes offered a rare escape. Stories read aloud in class allowed children to dream beyond hunger and cold. Literature, even censored, carried hints of beauty. Teachers who risked including poems or tales outside the approved list gave students glimpses of a larger world. Libraries, though short on books, remained places of quiet refuge, where children could sit in silence and lose themselves in words rather than war. Older students often left school entirely to work. Many entered factories, fields, or hospitals, balancing a few hours of study at night with long shifts during the day. Some were drafted into military training units, preparing for the possibility of joining the front. Childhood and adolescence were compressed, leaving little time for play or personal dreams. Yet even in this environment, bonds formed. Friendships grew strong in the shared struggle, and teachers became second parents to children whose families were broken by war. Schools, fragile and strained, became symbols of endurance. They reminded communities that life had to continue, that learning and growth could not be completely erased by hunger or fear. In every cramped classroom, lit by candles or kerosene lamps, the effort to teach and to learn was an act of resistance, a quiet statement that the future still mattered, even when the present seemed unbearable. Life in occupied Soviet territories revealed another layer of suffering during the war. When German forces advanced, millions of civilians suddenly found themselves under enemy rule. Entire towns were transformed overnight. Streets filled with foreign soldiers, local authorities were removed, and new laws were enforced with brutal speed. Food was seized for the occupying army, leaving civilians with almost nothing. Families scavenged for scraps, bartered with neighbours, or risked their lives trading secretly in forests. Hunger soon became as dangerous as the occupiers themselves. Fear was constant. German patrols walked through villages, and anyone suspected of aiding partisans faced harsh punishment. Families lived with the terror that a knock at the door might mean arrest or worse. Executions were sometimes carried out publicly to frighten others into obedience. Civilians quickly learned to speak carefully, avoid eye contact, and keep thoughts hidden deep inside. Children, too, were touched by this fear. Schools were closed or replaced with German-run classes teaching only basic skills. Many children stopped attending altogether, helping families search for food or hiding in forests with relatives. Orphans became common, wandering streets in rags, relying on strangers for survival. Yet even in occupied zones, resistance grew quietly. Partisans, small groups hiding in forests, relied on locals for shelter, food, and information. Families risked everything to give them bread or pass along a warning. Women sewed clothing for fighters, children acted as messengers, and farmers secretly hid supplies. These acts, though small, carried enormous danger, but they also gave civilians a sense of dignity in a world where power had been stripped away. Daily routines shrank to the barest essentials. People rose with the sun, searched for food, and retreated indoors before curfew. Nights were long, filled with whispers, prayers, and the sounds of boots echoing outside. Many clung to traditions in secret, lighting candles on holidays, singing songs in hushed tones, or baking bread when ingredients could be found. These quiet rituals reminded them of life before the war, preserving a sense of identity. Occupied life was not the same everywhere. Some towns experienced relative order, while others endured cruelty and destruction. Yet everywhere, survival meant caution, silence, and endurance. Civilians became shadows in their own homes, moving carefully, speaking little, and holding hope tightly against despair. For those who lived through it, the memory of occupation was carved into their lives. The hunger, the fear, and the quiet bravery that history often forgets. The story of the partisans, men and women who took to the forest to fight behind enemy lines, was one of courage and hardship. These groups formed quickly after German occupation, made up of soldiers cut off from their units, villagers seeking revenge, or young people unwilling to live under foreign rule. Life as a partisan was far from romantic. Fighters lived in damp shelters dug into the earth, camouflaged with branches and leaves. Food was scarce, often limited to whatever could be stolen, hunted, or shared by supportive villagers. Many survived on potatoes, dried berries, or thin soups cooked over small fires that had to be hidden from enemy patrols. Weapons were scarce too. Some partisans carried old rifles, others relied on grenades or even homemade explosives. Sabotage was their main weapon. They blew up railway tracks, cut telephone lines, and ambushed supply convoys. Each act slowed the enemy, forcing them to divert soldiers from the front. But these victories came at high cost. German forces hunted partisans relentlessly, and reprisals against villages suspected of helping them were brutal. Civilians risked everything when they left food in the forest or gave shelter to a fighter. Entire communities were sometimes destroyed in retaliation, yet the support never stopped completely. Women played a vital role in these units. They carried messages, gathered intelligence, and served as medics. Some fought directly, taking up rifles alongside men. Children, too, acted as couriers, slipping past checkpoints with notes hidden in shoes or baskets. Their bravery, though rarely recorded, kept partisan movements alive. Daily life in the forest demanded endurance. Winters were especially cruel, with fighters sleeping in dugouts barely large enough to keep out the wind. Clothes wore thin, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Still they pressed on, driven by loyalty to the motherland and the memory of families suffering under occupation. Songs and stories helped them endure. Around small fires they sang folk tunes or whispered tales of victory, imagining the day they could return home free. These moments of humanity softened the harshness of survival. Propaganda later celebrated partisans as heroes, and indeed they were. Yet their reality was a life of hunger, fear, and sacrifice. Many never returned from the forests, their names lost to history, but their resistance tied down enemy forces, gave hope to civilians, and proved that even under the harshest occupation, the will to fight for freedom could not be extinguished. The shadow of fear in Stalin's Soviet Union did not vanish even during the war. The secret police, known then as the NKVD, remained ever present, watching for signs of disloyalty or weakness. Citizens already endured hunger, cold, and exhaustion, but they also lived with the knowledge that a careless word could bring punishment. Suspicion reached into every apartment, school, and workplace. People learned to speak in whispers, even among friends, for fear that someone might report them. Sometimes accusations were false, born from jealousy or desperation, yet the consequences were real. Interrogations, imprisonment, or exile to labour camps could follow quickly. Wartime did not ease these policies, it often made them harsher. Soldiers who retreated or were captured were viewed with suspicion when they returned, as if survival itself was evidence of betrayal. Families of prisoners of war were often marked, carrying the burden of mistrust despite having done nothing wrong. Even in factories and farms, quotas were enforced with threats. Failing to meet production targets could bring investigations, and workers sometimes disappeared without explanation. Teachers reminded children to stay loyal, and students learned early that repeating slogans was safer than asking questions. Neighbours rarely spoke openly, and communities carried a silence heavy with unspoken fears. Yet people adapted to this atmosphere in quiet ways. They developed coded language, used gestures instead of words, and trusted only a very few with their honest thoughts. Families kept private conversations late at night, speaking softly over the sound of a radio or a boiling kettle to mask their voices. Diaries, when written, were hidden carefully, sometimes buried or disguised as school notebooks. Despite the constant surveillance, small acts of defiance survived. a joke whispered in safe company, a song sung behind closed doors, or a prayer before a hidden icon all carried meaning. These gestures reminded people that even under strict control, individuality could not be completely erased. Propaganda portrayed the Soviet Union as united, but beneath the surface, fear shaped every decision. Children grew up learning not only arithmetic and reading, but also caution, never to repeat what was said at home in the classroom. Adults carried the same lesson, moving through life with guarded expressions. The war demanded sacrifices, but it also deepened mistrust between the state and its people. Still, endurance remained. Despite fear, families continued to survive, to work, and to hope. Their strength lay not in open resistance, but in quiet resilience, in the ability to endure not only hunger and cold, but also the weight of suspicion pressing down on daily life. For Soviet soldiers returning from the front, life was not always a return to peace. Many who had survived unimaginable battles found themselves distrusted rather than welcomed. Those who had been captured by the enemy and later released faced particular suspicion. Instead of being greeted as survivors, they were often treated as traitors, accused of collaboration simply because they had lived. The state's policy was harsh. To be taken prisoner was seen as dishonour, and families of captured soldiers carried the same mark of shame. When these men returned, some were interrogated, others sent directly to labour camps far from home. Even decorated soldiers were not always safe from suspicion if someone doubted their loyalty. Veterans who escaped such accusations still faced enormous challenges. Their bodies bore wounds that rarely healed, missing limbs, blindness, or constant pain. Medical care was limited and prosthetics were primitive. Many soldiers learned to live with injuries while trying to support their families on small pensions. Some returned to find their homes destroyed, their villages gone, or their loved ones dead from hunger or bombing. Rebuilding life under such conditions was almost as hard as fighting at the front. Emotional wounds were just as deep. Soldiers carried memories of battle, of friends lost beside them, of nights spent in mud and snow under fire. These memories often returned in silence, in restless sleep, or in the way men stared into the distance without words. There was little understanding of these invisible scars, and few dared to speak openly of them. Families tried to bridge the gap, welcoming fathers, brothers, and sons back into homes that had learned to survive without them. Children, grown older in their absence, sometimes struggled to recognize them. Wives carried both relief and the burden of reintegrating someone who had changed beyond recognition. Communities celebrated victory, but the cost of survival weighed heavily. Work awaited immediately. Factories and fields needed labour, and veterans were expected to contribute without pause. For many, the transition from soldier to worker was abrupt, leaving no time to recover. Those unable to work were often left behind, surviving on meagre support and the kindness of relatives. Still, bonds of solidarity formed among veterans. They gathered in small groups, sharing memories, smoking together in silence, or recalling fallen comrades. These circles became places of understanding where unspoken pain could be felt without judgment. Propaganda showed images of strong, smiling heroes, but the truth was more complex. Veterans carried pride, yes, but also loss, suspicion, and struggle. Their return was not the end of hardship, but the beginning of another chapter of endurance in a society that valued victory yet sometimes distrusted the very men who had secured it. The life of Soviet prisoners of war taken by the Germans was among the harshest fates of the war. When captured, soldiers often faced immediate hunger, exhaustion, and brutality. Marches to camps stretched for miles with little food or water. Men collapsed on the roadsides, and guards rarely allowed them to be helped. Those who reached the camps entered a world of suffering. Barracks were overcrowded, with men sleeping on bare boards or even the ground, pressed tightly together for warmth. Food was almost non-existent, often just watery soup or a crust of bread. Disease spread quickly, with lice, dysentery and typhus claiming thousands of lives. For many, survival depended on luck as much as strength. Winter was especially deadly. Prisoners lacked warm clothing, and frostbite took fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs. Weak men froze at night, their bodies discovered stiff in the morning. Burial was often hurried, without ceremony, as others dug shallow graves with their bare hands. The psychological toll was just as heavy. Soldiers who had once marched proudly now felt abandoned, cut off from their homeland, uncertain if their families even knew they were alive. Letters were rare, and news of home almost non-existent. Some tried to keep spirits alive by telling stories, singing songs quietly at night, or carving small objects from scraps of wood. These fragile acts of humanity reminded them they were still alive. Escape was nearly impossible, but attempts were made. A few risked slipping away under cover of darkness, guided only by stars. Most were caught and punished severely, yet the very act of trying gave others hope. For those who survived until liberation, the ordeal did not end. Returning home to the Soviet Union often brought suspicion. Captivity was seen not as misfortune but as possible betrayal. Many ex-prisoners were interrogated, some sent to labour camps, others quietly watched for years. The stigma followed their families, leaving scars long after the war had ended. Yet despite everything, stories of resilience emerged. Some prisoners supported each other, sharing their last crumbs of bread or lifting the weak during marches. Acts of compassion became lifelines in a world designed to strip away dignity. Though their suffering was immense, their endurance was proof of a quiet strength that refused to die. Their experiences, often silenced in official history, remain a reminder of the countless lives caught between enemy cruelty and their own government's suspicion, living proof that survival sometimes demanded not only strength, but also the courage to hold on to hope in the darkest of places. The blockade of supplies across the Soviet Union meant that ordinary people had to become inventors of survival. Food was rationed to the smallest portions, and hunger pushed families to stretch ingredients in ways that would have seemed unimaginable before the war. Housewives learned to bake bread from ground husks, acorns, or even sawdust mixed with flour. Soups were made from nettles, dandelion leaves, or potato peels boiled again and again. Every scrap of food mattered. Crumbs carefully collected from the table, bones simmered for days until they gave no more flavour. In cities, long lines for rations defined daily life. People stood for hours in snow or rain, holding small ration cards like treasures. Sometimes the wait ended in disappointment, as supplies ran out before the line reached its end. Mothers often gave their own portions to children, watching silently as they ate, even when their own hunger burned. In rural areas, foraging became essential. Families gathered mushrooms, berries, and roots, filling baskets to supplement thin meals. Children learned to recognize edible plants at an early age, their lives depending on knowledge once considered old-fashioned. Gardens, no matter how small, were cultivated carefully, with every seed planted and protected as if it were gold. Clothing too was reinvented. With factories producing uniforms for soldiers, civilians wore patched garments until they nearly fell apart. Shoes were repaired again and again, soles replaced with wood or layers of cloth. In winter, straw was stuffed inside boots for warmth, and coats were shared among family members. Scarcity extended beyond food and clothing. Soap was rare, so people used ashes or homemade mixtures to wash. Candles were precious, lit only for the shortest time before being extinguished. Families learned to live in near darkness, relying on the glow of small stoves or kerosene lamps when fuel was available. Despite the constant shortages, creativity became a quiet act of defiance. Neighbours shared recipes for meals made from scraps. Children invented games with sticks and stones, and women sewed dolls from old fabric to comfort the youngest. These gestures, though small, brought moments of dignity and humanity. Black markets thrived in the shadows, offering bread, sugar, or tobacco at impossible prices. Trading a coat or a wedding ring for food became common, though dangerous if discovered. For many, survival balanced between official rations, private ingenuity, and quiet exchanges with strangers willing to help. Scarcity was not just a physical challenge, but also a test of spirit. Each family found ways to endure, to stretch what little they had, and to keep hope alive. In those years, the simplest acts, sharing a crust of bread, lighting a candle, mending a coat, became symbols of resilience in a world stripped down to its barest necessities. Music, art, and literature carried a special role in Soviet life during the war. Even as hunger and fear consumed daily existence, people sought beauty and meaning through culture. Concert halls, theatres, and libraries suffered from shortages just like factories and farms, yet they continued to function in remarkable ways. Musicians played with frozen fingers in unheated rooms, actors performed before audiences wrapped in coats, and poets recited verses that blended sorrow with hope. These moments offered escape, however brief, from the weight of survival. Perhaps the most famous example came from Leningrad, where Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony was performed in 1942 during the blockade. The orchestra, starving and weak, gathered to play despite exhaustion. Some musicians had to be carried to their seats, yet when the music began, the city listened in silence. The performance was broadcast through loudspeakers across Leningrad, echoing in bombed streets and shelters, reminding citizens that their spirit had not been broken. Across the country, theatres reopened even during bombings. Plays often carried patriotic themes, glorifying soldiers or celebrating workers, but they also gave audiences laughter and release. A comedy staged in a cold hall could lift weary hearts for an evening. Actors themselves endured the same shortages as everyone else, but they understood the power of their craft to keep morale alive. Literature also flourished, though tightly controlled. Writers produced novels, poems, and stories that celebrated sacrifice and unity. Many works were censored, shaped to match propaganda needs, yet readers still found comfort in words. Libraries, though often damaged, remained open, with people borrowing books as a way to escape hunger and cold. A novel read by candlelight could transport a reader beyond the war, if only for a moment. Songs were equally important. Soldiers carried accordions to the front, playing familiar folk tunes around campfires. Families at home sang lullabies or old village songs to children, blending tradition with the hope of better days. Even popular wartime songs praising courage and loyalty became part of daily life, hummed in kitchens or factories as people worked. Visual art adapted too. Posters dominated city walls, filled with bold colours and slogans. They called for endurance, mocked the enemy, and portrayed victory as certain. Yet private art survived in sketches drawn by soldiers in notebooks, or in portraits painted by hungry artists in exchange for food. These works, though small, captured emotions propaganda could not. Culture, in all its forms, gave people strength to endure. It was not only distraction, but also affirmation of humanity. In a time when daily life was reduced to survival, music, art, and literature reminded Soviet citizens that they were more than workers, soldiers, or victims. They were also dreamers, creators, and bearers of beauty that even war could not erase. The Soviet transportation system during the war was both a lifeline and a constant struggle. Railways became the arteries of the nation, carrying soldiers, weapons, and supplies across thousands of miles. Trains rattled day and night, often overloaded with cargo or passengers, pushing the limits of old tracks and worn engines. Civilians who travelled for evacuation or work faced harsh journeys. Carriages were crowded far beyond capacity, with families pressed shoulder to shoulder, their belongings stacked around them. Windows were sealed against the cold, leaving the air thick with smoke and breath. Food during travel was scarce, sometimes only a piece of bread or a mug of hot water at a station. Journeys that once took days stretched into weeks, as military shipments always had priority. For those living in cities, public transport nearly collapsed. Fuel shortages meant trams stopped running, Buses were rare, and most people walked long distances to work in factories or offices. Streets filled with workers trudging through snow, often in worn boots or wrapped feet. Bicycles became precious possessions, repaired again and again, their wheels carrying people silently through darkened streets. In rural areas, horses and carts were requisitioned by the army, leaving villagers to carry loads themselves. Women pulled sledges of firewood, children dragged baskets of grain, and men home from the front helped rebuild carts from scraps of wood and metal. Roads, often unpaved, turned to mud in spring and froze into ruts in winter, making even short journeys exhausting. River transport also played a role. Barges carried goods along the Volga and other major waterways, though they were vulnerable to enemy attacks. In besieged Leningrad, the road of life across frozen Lake Ladoga became a symbol of survival. Trucks drove across the ice under bombardment, carrying bread into the city and evacuating children out. Drivers risked everything as the ice cracked and bombs fell, but without this route the city might not have endured. Air transport was limited but vital for urgent supplies and communications. Small planes carried mail, medicines, and sometimes wounded soldiers. For civilians, however, flying was a distant dream. Most never saw the inside of a plane. Travel, when it happened at all, was slow, cold, and uncertain. Yet transportation, despite its struggles, kept the Soviet Union alive. Railways stitched together distant regions, bringing grain from Siberia, coal from the Donbass, and weapons from the Urals. Roads and rivers, though treacherous, carried the weight of survival. For ordinary people, every step on frozen streets or every mile on a crowded train was part of the larger war effort, endured with the same quiet resilience that defined so much of life in those years. Housing during the war years became one of the most pressing struggles for Soviet civilians. With millions displaced by evacuation, bombing, or occupation, cities were overwhelmed by the sudden influx of people. Apartments once built for a single family often housed 3 or 4, with each family squeezed into a single room. Corridors and kitchens became shared spaces, filled with noise, arguments, and the constant smell of cooking whatever scraps of food could be found. Privacy disappeared almost completely. Curtains or old sheets were hung to divide space, but voices carried easily through thin walls. Families learned to live in silence, keeping conversations brief and cautious, knowing that even within crowded homes trust could not be assumed. Children played in hallways, their laughter mixed with the cries of babies and the footsteps of workers coming and going at all hours. Bombing raids added to the housing crisis. Entire blocks were destroyed, forcing survivors to find shelter wherever possible, in basements, attics, or the homes of relatives. Some lived in schools or factories temporarily converted into housing, while others built small huts or dugouts on the outskirts of cities. In rural areas, evacuees often crowded into wooden houses already too small for the families who lived there. Beds were shared by several people, while others slept on floors or benches. Winter made these conditions even harsher, as stoves barely warmed the crowded rooms and frost crept across walls. Despite the hardship, people found ways to adapt. Neighbours shared stoves and cooking pots, pooling resources to prepare thin soups or bread. They took turns caring for children, allowing mothers to work long shifts in factories or fields. Arguments over space and noise were frequent, but moments of solidarity also appeared. A shared song, a holiday meal, or a small act of kindness could transform the atmosphere, if only briefly. The state attempted to organise housing, but shortages were too great. Posters urged people to accept evacuees as part of their patriotic duty, yet resentment sometimes grew. Overcrowding bred tension as families accustomed to their own homes adjusted to sharing everything, from space to silence. Furniture, when destroyed or burned for fuel, was rarely replaced, and many households survived with only the barest essentials. Children grew up in these cramped conditions, learning to sleep through noise and study on narrow windowsills or kitchen tables. For them, such crowded living became normal, shaping memories that would stay long after the war ended. Housing was not just a question of comfort, but of survival. Warmth, safety, and shelter meant life in a time when bombs and hunger threatened constantly. Families endured, not because conditions were easy, but because they had no other choice. In every cramped room, in every shared kitchen, the determination to keep going revealed itself quietly, as people built lives within walls that had barely enough space to hold them. Black markets, though officially condemned, became a hidden but essential part of survival in Stalin's Soviet Union during the war. Official rations were never enough to sustain life, so people turned to quiet exchanges in alleys, train stations, or hidden courtyards. Here, food, clothing, and even medicine changed hands, though at prices few could afford. A loaf of bread might cost a month's wages, and sugar or butter were treasures beyond reach for most families. Cigarettes and tobacco often served as currency, traded for potatoes, flour, or even matches. Jewellery, family heirlooms, and wedding rings disappeared into the hands of traders, exchanged for a few meals that kept children alive. These transactions carried great risk. The state denounced the black market as betrayal, and anyone caught trading outside official rationing faced punishment. Yet desperation outweighed fear. For mothers with starving children or workers too weak to stand, the underground market became the only lifeline. Traders themselves came from all walks of life. Peasants bringing hidden crops from villages, factory workers smuggling small items, or even officials using their positions to profit. Some grew rich in secret, while others bartered only to survive another week. Alongside food, clothing was a vital commodity. A warm coat might be traded for sacks of grain, boots for a handful of butter. Children's shoes were especially precious, passed from one family to another at high cost. Medicine, too, appeared rarely but at immense value. Aspirin, bandages, or even herbal remedies were bought and sold in hushed voices, saving lives when hospitals had nothing to offer. Though dangerous, the black market also showed resilience. It revealed how people adapted, creating systems of exchange when the official ones collapsed. Neighbours whispered about where to find a trader, families pooled resources to make purchases, and strangers sometimes shared what they had gained. The underground economy, though condemned, often became the difference between life and death. At the same time, resentment brewed. Those unable to access the black market, too poor, too isolated, watched others survive while they starved. Inequality deepened, and the contrast between propaganda's image of unity and the reality of quiet desperation grew sharper. Yet even here, small sparks of kindness appeared. Traders occasionally lowered prices for mothers with children, or neighbours shared a portion of what they had bought. These moments, though rare, reminded people that humanity could persist in hidden corners. The black market was never spoken of openly, but it lived in the shadows of every city and village. It was a mirror of the war itself, dangerous, uncertain, and unfair, yet also proof of the human will to endure against impossible odds. Holidays during the war years carried a very different meaning in the Soviet Union. Official celebrations continued, but they were stripped down to their most basic form, shaped more by survival than by joy. New Year's, usually marked with decorated trees and family gatherings, became quiet evenings around a single candle. A small piece of bread sprinkled with sugar might serve as a treat for children, while parents told stories to make up for the absence of gifts. Victory Day did not yet exist, but other holidays, such as May Day or the anniversary of the October Revolution, were still marked by parades or speeches, though on a smaller scale. Propaganda used these events to remind people of unity and sacrifice, while citizens often saw them as brief breaks from routine rather than real celebrations. Religious holidays, though discouraged by the state, were observed in secret. Easter bread was baked when ingredients could be found, even if it was only made of coarse flour and water. Families dyed eggs with onion skins, creating faint colours that children treasured. Candles flickered before hidden icons, and prayers rose quietly, blending with the sounds of war outside. These traditions, fragile but enduring, gave families strength. Weddings took place even in the darkest times, though without grandeur. Couples exchanged vows in small gatherings, wearing old clothes mended for the occasion. Guests brought whatever they could, sometimes just a loaf of bread or a jar of jam to mark the day. Despite the absence of luxury, such events became symbols of hope, proof that life continued. Funerals were far more common, though often without ceremony. With so many lost at the front or in bombings, mourning became quiet and private. Families lit candles at home, whispered prayers, or kept a photograph on a windowsill as a memorial. Public displays of grief were rare, as survival left little time for rituals. Children experienced holidays differently. Without toys or sweets, they created games from scraps of wood or cloth. A simple paper star on a wall or a small evergreen branch in winter could feel magical. Parents told folk tales, sang songs, or acted out plays in kitchens to give children moments of joy. These small efforts, though humble, left lasting memories of warmth amid hardship. Holidays were no longer about abundance, but about togetherness. They offered a pause in endless labour, a reminder of traditions, and a spark of hope that someday life might return to normal. In kitchens, crowded apartments, and hidden corners of villages, families celebrated not with riches but with presence, proving that even in war, the human heart searched for light in the darkest of days. Childhood games and friendships in wartime Soviet Union carried a special weight, shaped by scarcity and constant fear, yet still filled with imagination. Children, even in hunger and cold, found ways to play, because play was a form of survival. In bombed-out courtyards, they built forts from rubble and pretended to be soldiers, using sticks as rifles and bricks as tanks. Games of hide-and-seek took place in ruined buildings, their laughter echoing through broken windows. Though the war surrounded them, children carved out spaces of escape with creativity. Toys were rare. Dolls were sewn from scraps of cloth, stuffed with straw or rags. A wooden block could become a truck, a carved stick a horse. A few lucky children held on to toys from before the war, guarding them as treasures. Sharing a doll or a ball made from bundled socks often built friendships that lasted a lifetime. Hunger, however, was never far away. Children played in lines while waiting for rations, kicking pebbles or drawing shapes in the dirt to distract themselves from empty stomachs. Their games were shorter, slower, often interrupted by exhaustion. Still, these moments gave parents hope, showing that innocence had not been completely erased. Friendships formed quickly in such conditions. Children who had lost parents found comfort in neighbours or classmates. Bonds were made over shared crusts of bread, whispered secrets in schoolyards, or small acts of kindness like lending a coat on a freezing walk home. For many, friends became extensions of family, sources of strength when everything else was uncertain. Education and propaganda coloured even children's play. They sang patriotic songs, drew pictures of planes and tanks, and acted out battles where the Soviet Union always won. Yet beneath this, their games revealed deeper truths: fear of bombings, longing for absent fathers, or dreams of food and warmth. A pretend wedding between dolls, a play feast made from pebbles and leaves, showed how much they yearned for normal life. Despite hardships, joy still appeared. A snowfall could transform bleak streets into playgrounds. Children sled on makeshift boards, built snowmen with coal eyes, or simply lay in the snow, creating shapes with outstretched arms. In spring, kites made from rags flew above courtyards, bright against grey skies. These fleeting joys reminded families that childhood, though altered, endured. Parents watched their children play with mixed emotions: sorrow at what had been lost, but gratitude that laughter could still exist. In the midst of hunger, bombings, and fear, children's games became quiet acts of defiance, proof that even in the harshest times, Imagination could carve light out of darkness. The Soviet system of labour camps, known as the Gulag, did not pause during the war. In fact, it expanded. While much of the nation fought against the external enemy, countless prisoners toiled behind barbed wire, contributing to the war effort under brutal conditions. These camps held political prisoners, people accused of disloyalty, and ordinary citizens caught by suspicion or quotas. For them, survival meant endless work, hunger, and fear. Camps were scattered across Siberia, the Arctic, and remote regions where winters were unforgiving, and summers brought swarms of insects. Prisoners lived in wooden barracks, often overcrowded, damp, and unheated. Beds were simple planks of wood, packed tightly together, with thin blankets offering little warmth. Food was meagre: thin soup, a slice of bread, sometimes a few boiled grains. Hunger gnawed constantly, and many grew weak, unable to endure both labour and starvation. Work defined life in the Gulag. Prisoners cut timber in frozen forests, mined coal and gold, built roads and railways, and constructed factories crucial for the war. Tools were primitive, protective clothing non-existent. Men swung axes with frozen hands, women hauled heavy logs, and all laboured from dawn until nightfall. Those who slowed or faltered faced punishment or lost food rations, which often meant death. The psychological strain was just as harsh. Prisoners lived with uncertainty, unsure if they would ever be released, even after sentences ended. Letters from home were rare and censored, yet treasured when they arrived. Some clung to small acts of resilience, carving wood, singing old songs quietly, or writing hidden notes to preserve their humanity. Guards enforced strict discipline, but even among them, differences appeared. Some treated prisoners with cruelty, others with a distant indifference, and a few showed small acts of kindness, like sharing tobacco or turning away from minor rule breaking. For the prisoners, these gestures could mean the difference between despair and survival. Women in the camps endured particular hardship. Alongside labour, they faced the dangers of overcrowded barracks, poor hygiene, and vulnerability to exploitation. Yet many found strength in supporting each other, sharing food, caring for the sick, or creating surrogate families to replace those torn away. Despite the suffering, the Gulag contributed significantly to the Soviet war effort. Timber-built fortifications, minerals-fed factories, and railways connected distant regions. Yet the cost was measured in lives lost silently, far from the front lines. When the war ended, survivors carried scars both physical and unseen. Many were not celebrated as contributors, but remained marked by suspicion. Their voices rarely reached history books, but their endurance was part of the hidden foundation upon which the wartime Soviet Union stood. The final years of the war brought both exhaustion and fragile hope to Soviet civilians. By 1944 and 1945, the tide had turned, and the Red Army pushed westward, reclaiming lands once lost. Yet for those at home, daily life was still shaped by shortages, overcrowding, and grief. Victory seemed closer, but survival still demanded sacrifice. Families continued to line up for rations, their bread still dark and small, their meals stretched thin with herbs or bark. Factories worked without pause, producing weapons at the same relentless pace. Children, many already grown beyond their years, balanced work and school, carrying the scars of hunger in their thin frames. Even as the front moved away, air raids and bombings still struck some cities, keeping fear alive in the nights. Letters from soldiers brought glimpses of hope. Many wrote of advances, of German retreats, of villages liberated. These words carried joy, but also sorrow, as lists of fallen comrades grew. Families clung to the thought that the end was near, yet the silence of missing letters reminded them that not all would return. Communities bore deep wounds. Entire villages had lost most of their men. Streets in cities echoed with the voices of women and children. while many fathers, brothers and husbands remained absent forever. Funerals were brief and quiet, often without bodies, marked by photographs placed on tables surrounded by candles and whispered prayers. Despite exhaustion, small celebrations emerged as victory drew closer. On New Year's, families managed tiny feasts from whatever they could gather, perhaps a pie from potatoes or a sweet from boiled sugar beets. These moments, though humble, symbolized endurance. Children laughed, neighbors shared songs, and for a few hours the weight of war seemed lighter. Rumors of liberation filled the air. People listened eagerly to radios, reading between the lines of official announcements. Each report of advancing Soviet troops brought relief, but also caution, for no one dared celebrate too early. The memory of long years of suffering kept joy restrained. As the Red Army marched into Berlin in 1945, news of impending victory spread quickly. In villages and cities, people gathered in streets, though many were too weak to shout or dance. Tears flowed more easily than cheers. Victory was real, yet its cost was everywhere. Empty chairs at tables, photographs on walls, scars on bodies and souls. For civilians, the end of war meant not celebration alone, but the beginning of another struggle. Rebuilding homes, families and lives shattered by years of hunger, fear and loss. Still, beneath grief lay resilience. The Soviet people had endured, carrying their nation through its harshest trial. Victory was theirs, but so too was the heavy memory of what survival had required. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Soviet Union stood victorious, but the victory was carved from suffering so deep that it would shape generations. For ordinary people, the end of war did not bring immediate relief. Cities lay in ruins, villages were burned, and families were torn apart by absence. Women who had carried the burden of labour and survival returned to homes with empty chairs, their husbands or sons gone forever. Children, hardened by hunger and fear, stepped into adulthood with memories of games played among rubble and of nights spent shivering in unheated rooms. The rebuilding began slowly. Streets were cleared of debris, factories restarted production, and fields were replanted, yet the scars of war were everywhere. Hunger did not vanish overnight. Rationing continued, and people still stood in long lines for bread. Housing remained crowded, with families squeezed into single rooms while entire blocks of apartments were reconstructed. In rural areas, peasants returned to charred fields, determined to coax life from the soil once again. Despite these hardships, a spirit of resilience carried people forward. They planted gardens, patched clothing, and gathered for small celebrations when possible. Weddings and births brought moments of joy, reminders that life was beginning anew. Songs, stories, and traditions re-emerged, carrying both grief and hope in their melodies. Veterans returned home with pride, but also with wounds, some visible, others buried deep. Many spoke little of their experiences, choosing silence over words that could not capture what they had endured. Families embraced them, yet also learned to live with the quiet distance of men forever changed by war. Suspicion lingered, as the state continued to view former prisoners of war or those touched by occupation with mistrust. Fear remained part of daily life, even as people celebrated the triumph over Germany. Propaganda filled the streets with posters of victory, parades marched with banners high, and Stalin was praised as the great leader of the nation. Yet behind the public celebrations, private lives were filled with rebuilding, mourning, and survival. For many, victory was not fireworks or songs in the square, but the simple relief of waking to a day without bombings. The legacy of those years was complex. On one hand, pride in endurance and sacrifice bound the people together. On the other, the cost of survival weighed heavily on every household. Millions of lives had been lost, and those who remained carried memories etched into their souls. The hunger of endless winters, the fear of secret police, the silence of waiting for letters that never came. Still, through all of it, the Soviet people endured. Their strength lay not only in battles won on distant fronts, but in kitchens where mothers stretched scraps into meals, in schools where children studied by candlelight, in factories where women forged steel with weary hands, and in the quiet prayers whispered at night. Life in Stalin's Soviet Union during the war was a story of survival against impossible odds. It was harsh, unforgiving, and marked by loss, yet within it burned a quiet resilience. That resilience, carried by millions of ordinary people, became the true foundation of victory, a reminder that even in the darkest times the human spirit can endure and rebuild,